All right. So tonight we are in Genesis chapters 20 through 23, and we're continuing the journey of Abraham. Last week we saw the confirmation of the covenant. We saw him rescue or intervening with God on Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's family, and there was a lot of bizarre stuff that happened in last week's. And today's section is it's strange in some ways as well. There's also going to be an echo to something that happened in the past. And so, just in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham's behavior in Egypt with telling Sarah to pretend she's his sister, that comes again. So, let's just jump into chapter 20, verse 1, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. So, from there, Abraham traveled. So, there being the region around Sodom and Gomorrah. From there, Abraham traveled to the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. So, he's traveling south. While he was staying in Gerar, Abraham said about his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So, King Abimelech of Gerar had Sarah brought to him. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he had said, "Lord, would you destroy a nation even though it is innocent? Didn't he himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother'? I did this with a clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you did this with a clear conscience. I have also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I have not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, know that you will certainly die, and you and all who are yours." Early in the morning, Abimelech got up, called all his servants together, and personally told them all these things, and the men were terrified. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said to him, "What have you done to us? How did I sin against you, that you have brought such enormous guilt on me and on my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done." Abimelech also asked Abraham, "What made you do this?" Abraham replied, "I thought there is absolutely no fear of God in this place. They will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So when God had me wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'Show your loyalty to me wherever we go, and say about me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took flocks and herds and male and female slaves, gave them to Abraham, and returned his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, 'Look, my land is before you. Settle wherever you want.' And he said to Sarah, 'Look, I am giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a verification of your honor to all who are with you. You are fully vindicated.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves, so they could bear children. For the Lord had completely closed all the wombs in Abimelech's household on account of Sarah, Abraham's wife." All right, so that is um, a unique situation, but a not unique situation as we think about the life of Abraham. And so, where we last left him, he was, interacting with the three visitors, and one of them being the Lord and the two angels. And we see him interacting and pleading with God for the sake of Sodom and Gomorrah, to protect Lot and Lot's family. And so now we see like this faithfulness here with him, and this boldness with God. And then in this very next chapter, we see Abraham acting fearfully. He's afraid that the people of this region, and he's getting closer to Egypt as he's traveling south. So he's afraid that the people of this region will try to take Sarah from him, possibly even kill him. And so this has been part of the ongoing um, practice of Abraham, is telling people that they're not married, but they are brother and sister. And there's reasons for this about their like negotiation power and putting themselves in a place of protection. And it's technically not a lie. It's just not all the whole truth, because in their culture, they had two different moms, and so they weren't fully brother and sister, and that was apparently accepted. But the um, the outcome of this behavior is that God is bringing punishment on the Abimelech's kingdom and his family because of this disobedience. Um, Now, as I read this, I think through, like, that doesn't seem super fair that it's coming to Abimelech and not to Abraham. Um, but there's something interesting in this passage that I think the moral of the story is not go be like Abraham. But the moral really is, like, even in our own brokenness and our own mistakes, God can still do something to show that He is sovereign, that He's in control. And so while Abimelech takes Sarah into his harem, essentially, and he hasn't been intimate with her, but he is like going that direction. He God appears to him in a dream to tell him, like, this is wrong. And in the Bible, like, the people who are normally interacting with God in dreams are the his elect people, his prophets, those kinds of folks. And so Abimelech is not a part of the family of Abraham, not a part of the family of God, but here God is showing up to him so that a prophet can speak into Abimelech's life. And this is actually the first time in the Bible where we see that word prophet, and it's applied to Abraham. So Abraham is the first prophet in the Bible, and God's instructions is saying, like, look, if you don't stop what you're doing with Sarah, you're gonna die. So get Abraham, and he will pray for you. And so this is a confirmation to Abimelech that Abraham is not to be messed with. That Abraham is not somebody who should be. You shouldn't try to take Sarah. You shouldn't try to take advantage of him in any way. He is God's chosen prophet. And so as he does everything God tells him, like, and he confronts him, like, why are you doing this? And one of the interesting things is, like, Abimelech's response uh, compared to Pharaoh's response. Pharaoh was asking him why he lied. Abimelech says, "What have I done? How have I sinned against you?" And so Abimelech is trying to ask, like, why didn't you trust me? Did I do something to you? And he didn't. Abimelech didn't do anything to Abraham. They simply did not. They were just living in fear, and this was their custom. What they were doing, all throughout the region, apparently, because this is what Abraham told Sarah to do. When we go into these lands, tell them that you're my sister. Um, and as Abraham is telling this story and, like, and talking about all of this, like, Abimelech is like, well, stop it. And he gives them money. Like, so in Egypt, Pharaoh gave Abraham money. He gave him flocks and all kinds of servants. Like, he enriched Abraham. Here again, Abraham is enriched by these people because they're trying to earn favor with the Lord through the prophet. They're trying to, like, have right relationship. And so one of the interesting things as well is when Abimelech says, here is the money, I give it to you for your honor. He's telling Sarah that. He's trying to honor Sarah more than he's trying to honor Abraham, which is interesting. Um, the um, and the amount of money was 1,000 shekels, which is a lot of money. And it might be like 1,000 sometimes in the Old Testament is like a perfect number. It's like it's more than you really need to count. But it is um, it would be more than a worker could expect to make in a lifetime, is one way to think about the amount of money that he gives him here. And so he leaves this whole situation with Abimelech. Like, Abraham is not like a super faithful person. He still has moments of fear. So he's kind of like us, but he also leaves and this is something that Walter Brueggemann says as he's talking about this. He says Abraham emerges from the narrative with his power and authority not only intact but enhanced, which is one of the ironies of this passage. That is, he's the one who lies, and he is still the one who is preferred, which is mind-boggling. The morally upright one is Abimelech, and he is dependent on Israel. The preeminence of Abraham here rests not on Abraham's virtue, but on God's promise. The story has a strangeness about it, perhaps because the theological narrator wanted to make a point that ill-fitted the traditional material with which he had to work. As it stands, the text makes the claim that Abraham is the chosen of God, not by words, not even by faith, which is feeble here, but only by God's incredible grace. Thus, we can hardly advance on Calvin, another theologian's summary, the infirmity of man and the grace of God. The infirmity of both men, Abraham and Abimelech, is evident, but God's grace overrules it. And so, yeah, it just is an interesting story here. It is, we look through Genesis, we see God's election of a chosen people all through. Noah was a friend of God, walked with God. Abraham has a face-to-face kind of relationship with God, but he still has moments of doubt. But God is consistent in trying to preserve his line. God is going to keep his promises. And so one of the interesting things in this is how it ends, because there's one of the curses that's on the household of Abimelech is that none of the women can conceive. But as Abraham prays for Abimelech, the wombs of the women are opened and they're able to conceive again, which creates a bit of a transition to the next chapter in chapter 21. The Lord came to Sarah, and as he had said, the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. At the appointed time, God had told him. Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. She also said, who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne a son for him in his old age. And so I just think it's very interesting that when the prophet Abraham prays for somebody else to be able to conceive, that's when Sarah is able to conceive. Like the juxtaposition of these events is fascinating to me. But after this long delay of waiting and waiting and waiting, the promise is starting to finally happen. It's starting to come true. There is a problem, though, in the narrative as we keep reading, because Abraham has a son, Ishmael. And as we remember last week, Hagar found out she's pregnant and she was running away. And so this week, Ishmael's been born and he's older. It's been about 13 years. So let's keep reading in verse 8. Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar, the Egyptian, had born to Abraham, so Ishmael. So she said to him, drive out this slave with her son, for the son of this slave will not be co-heir with my son, Isaac. This was very distressing to Abraham because of his son, Ishmael. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed about the boy and about your slave. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. And I will also make a nation of the slave's son, because he is your offspring." Early in the morning, Abraham got up and took bread and a water skin, put them on Hagar's shoulders, and sent her and the boy away. She left and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she left the boy under one of the bushes and went and sat at a distance, about a bow shot away. For she said, "I can't bear to watch the boy die." While she sat at a distance, she wept loudly. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying from the place where he is. Get up, help the boy up, and grasp his hand, and I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. So she went and filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew. He settled in the wilderness and became an archer. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So Isaac is born. Isaac means laughter. And the next story after Isaac's birth is Isaac being mocked. He's being laughed at. He's being ridiculed by his older half brother, Ishmael, which creates this tension between Sarah and Abraham, and she wants to get rid of him. And, Abraham loves Ishmael. So this is difficult for him. And God's promise is, "I'm going to do what I've told you I'm going to do. I'm going to take care of him. So just go send him away." Now, as I was reflecting on this passage and the coming passage, God asks Abraham to give up his sons twice. This first one, he's trusting that God will take care of him and Hagar, and God does. But I wonder if that was a bit of a practice experience for Abraham. Because in a little bit, we're going to see how God asked him to sacrifice Isaac to give him up. And so Abraham trusts the Lord, and he sends Ishmael away. And as they're going, Hagar thought that they were going to die. And Ishmael is not a young child at this point. I mean, he could be about 13 years old. And so he would have been big having a 14-year-old. I mean, 14-year-old boys are not small. And so he would have been a big kid. And, probably dehydrated, dying of thirst. And Hagar just puts him under a rock and leaves him to die. And then the angel of the Lord shows up. And he is the God who sees her. God hears her, the cries of Hagar and Ishmael. And he comes to rescue and to provide. And the Ishmaelites, they are going to be a part of God's plan, but they are not the part of God's promise. And I think that's something that is important as we read through Genesis, is the juxtaposition of God's plan and God's promise. God's promise is that he's going to make Abraham a great nation, and the world will be blessed through Abraham's descendant, and that is going to be fulfilled through Isaac. But God still has a plan for the nations. As we go all the way back to Noah, and then chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel and dispersion of the people, like God has a plan. And in the midst of all of the grand plan, there's a thread that is God's promise. And so he's trusting that God will continue to do this work. So Ishmael is rescued. Ishmael does become a great nation. And the contrast between Israel and Ishmael for the next, the tribes of Ishmael, I should say, for the next many centuries. It's going to be there's going to be conflict there, but they come from the same Father. And so let's keep going as we are jumping into 22. At that time, Abimelech, remember Abimelech, the guy who Abraham lied to? Abimelech, accompanied by Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Swear to me by God here and now that you will not break an agreement with me or with my children and descendants, as I have been loyal to you, so you will be loyal to me and to the country where you are a resident alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of the well that Abimelech's servant had seized. Abimelech replied, I do not know who did this thing. You did not report anything to me, so I hadn't heard about it until today. Abraham took flocks and herds and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. Abraham separated 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, Why have you separated these 7 ewe lambs? He replied, You are to accept the 7 ewe lambs from me, so that this act will serve as my witness that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because it was there that the two of them swore an oath. After they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham lived as an alien in the land of the Philistines for many days. So we are at another conflict of the shepherd life. Remember, Abraham and Lot were conflicting with their herders, and that led them to separate. And here Abimelech comes and says, look, I don't want any conflicts. I want us to have a good, peaceful relationship. You are a resident alien. Essentially, Abimelech is telling Abraham, like, you have no real rights to own anything in this region because you're not from here. But I want you to be comfortable here. I want you to know that we can live peacefully here. And so Abraham airs his grievances. Like, look, your guys are taking my water, and water is life. And so they try to solve this whole conflict. And these 7 lambs, they are essentially the seal of the covenant between Abimelech and Abraham. And these could have been sacrificed because remember, covenants involve cutting. And so they are sealing the covenant together. And that's where this name Beersheba comes from. Now, if you remember, like just the last chapter, Hagar went to Beersheba. This is where she is. Like, she's not far from here, but this is where we find out where Beersheba is named and why it's named this. And it's called it means well of oath or well of 7. So these 7 lambs are part of this tying to their covenant of water rights of peace between Abimelech and Abraham. And he's kind of buying this well, even though he is still a nomadic herder type person. He hasn't set down real roots. He's got the oaks by Mamre that he goes to, and now here he plants a tamarisk tree, and this is another sign for fertility. Like throughout, we've seen Abraham like parking his tent by the trees, and this is a place where he's creating sacred spots. And so here he is planting this tree. It's a life-giving plant symbolizing a fertile and prosperous future, reminding them of the treaty between Abimelech and Abraham. And so things seem to be putting down roots, right? Literally and figuratively. And so this chapter continues, or chapter 22 starts, and this is where we see the second time Abraham is commanded to give up a son. And verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. And his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here and with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand, he took the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham, and he said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Then the two of them walked on together. When they arrived at the palace, or at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." He replied, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horn. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is said, "It will be provided on the Lord's mountain." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing, you have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my command." And Abraham went back to his young men, and they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. Now, this the story is intense when you put yourself in the text. Like, Abraham has waited 100 years for this child, and now God is saying, "I want you to sacrifice the child." And human sacrifice was something that would have been known in the larger cultures, but it is never something that God uh, asks his people to do throughout the Bible, except here. This is the one story, and the we've probably all heard sermons about Abraham and Isaac and this story, and like talking about you need to be willing to lay down your treasure and let the Lord like offer these as sacrifices, and the Lord will provide, right? And that's part of what's happening here. And the question is, will you trust the Lord? And Abraham has already had to give up Ishmael, to say, "Go, Ishmael, be separate," trusting that the Lord will provide for Ishmael. And now Abraham's faith is being tested again. And so he's being asked to bring his son and sacrifice him. And Abraham has to trust that the Lord will provide for Abraham. The Lord has provided. The impossible has happened. Sarah at 90 years old has had a baby. Like these are all things that are happening. And so as he's doing this, Isaac is old enough to talk to Abraham. So maybe like a teenager, maybe even older. He's old enough to ask him questions like, "Hey, I see we're all set here for this sacrifice, except for one thing. There's no lamb. God will provide." And then Isaac is on the altar to be sacrificed. God will provide. This is intense. And the way that God talks about Isaac is your son, your only son whom you love. And there's a little echo here in the life and ministry of Jesus as well. Because when Jesus is baptized, the voice from heaven says, "You are my son whom I love." And when we look at the life of Jesus, God is asking Abraham to offer his son, and at the right moment, God stops him from actually offering his son. But God himself is willing to offer his son as the sacrifice for us. God's faithfulness is beyond the faithfulness required of Abraham, because God knew that he would not spare his son. Like God would not spare his own son, is that how I should say that? And so there's a lot of powerful imagery and echoes throughout this story that leans back to the life of Jesus, but also looking at where this story takes place. They go to the Mount of Moriah, and this is a place later on in the history of Israel. David has to, there's a plague that's coming through the people because of David's disobedience and having a census and counting the people. And God told him not to do that. He did it anyway. God sends a plague, and David offers a sacrifice on the thresher's land there on Mount Moriah. David buys Mount Moriah. So the place where God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, that's the place that David bought from the man to offer a sacrifice to stop the plague. That's the place where they would build the temple in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the place just outside the gates where Jesus would lay his life down for the sins of the world. And there's something about Mount Moriah. There's something about this place that is significant in God's plan of redemption. And all the way through this chapter, God will provide, God will provide, God will provide. And God does provide. God provides this sacrifice to take Isaac's place. And in the future, God provides the sacrifice to take our place, to take to bear the cost for our sin. And so there's this is a much more beautiful story when you look in light of all of Scripture and God's plan of redemption. It's not just Abraham is being tested. It is Abraham being tested, and it's so much more. It's just this thing that echoes all the way throughout the rest of Scripture. And it is so tied to this hill, this mountain. And one of the things, and in researching, ancient cosmology and different theologies and cultures, like they believed in like thin places where God or the heavens met the earth. And that's one of the reasons why the Tower of Babel was a tower to try to get to God, because God would come down. Here on Mount Moriah, this is a place where God, the angel of the Lord, which clearly is the Lord swearing by himself at the end there, God comes and meets Abraham there. So the temple becomes this place where God comes and dwells among his people. And so this is a very important little story in the book of Genesis for the whole history of the people of Israel. And so, yeah, so it's interesting. There's a lot going on in this little chapter. And Abraham proves to be faithful. God proves to be faithful. And I don't know what kind of effect this would have had on their family dynamic between Abraham and Isaac after that. But Abraham could just say, look, I told you God would provide, and God would provide. I don't know if Isaac ever thought, Dad, remember that time you tried to kill me? Can I borrow the horses? So I don't know. That's how my family would have approached something like that. Anyway, keep going. There's a little section here in verse 20. Now, after these things, Abraham was told, Milcah also has borne sons to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, his brother Buzz. Buzz. It's not just a cool toy from Toy Story. Kemuel, the father of Aram, Hesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel fathered Rebekah, Milcah bore these 8 to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also bore Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. So why are we being told this right here? This is a weird place to talk about Abraham's brother's family. And I think it's important because we are watching what's happening with Abraham's promise from God being fulfilled, but Isaac is still by himself. And so we need to figure out, like, okay, how's Isaac going to have a family? He's clearly, God has proved his promise. He preserved him from a sacrifice. He's doing something great in Isaac. Where's this kid going to get a family? And we see the first indication in this section here. And Bethuel fathered Rebekah. Rebekah will be Isaac's wife. Now, in this section, Rebekah is the only daughter that is named. And there's another little interesting detail. There are 12 sons. And Jacob will have 12 sons. Like this, 12 becomes an important number in Old Testament for the tribes of Israel and all of that. But here we see just a kind of a parallel of here's these 12 sons and a daughter. Jacob has 12 sons and at least one daughter that we will read about in one of the stories in the coming weeks. So we have this, just a quick aside. There's a Rebecca over here that Isaac is going to be very interested in later. So we get a little hint for that. Let's keep going. Chapter 20, 23. Now Sarah lived 127 years. And I'm just going to pause right there. This is the only woman in the Bible that we are given an age for when they died. The whole Bible, Sarah is the only one. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were all the years of her life. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. When Abraham got up from the bedside of his dead wife, he spoke to the Hittites. I am an alien residing among you. And remember, that was what Abimelech said. You are an alien resident. I'm an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, listen to us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in our finest burial place. None of us will withhold from you his burial place for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, if you are willing for me to bury my dead, listen to me and ask Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf, to give me the cave at Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me in your presence for the full price as burial property. Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. So in the hearing of all the Hittites who came to the gate of this city, Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham, no, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in sight of my people. Bury your dead. Abraham bowed down to the people of the land and said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, listen to me, if you please. Let me pay the price of the field. Accept it from me, and let me bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham and said to him, my lord, listen to me. Land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out to Ephron the silver that he had agreed to in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 standard shekels of silver. So Ephron, a field at Machpelah near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees anywhere within the boundary of the field, became Abraham's possession in the sight of all the Hittites who came to the gate of the city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field at Machpelah near Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field with its cave passed from the Hittites to Abraham as burial property. So this is a long story about how Abraham bought the cave to bury Sarah. And this is where Abraham will be buried. This is where his Isaac will be buried. This becomes a very important part of the history of the people of Israel are these caves. And so the taking the time to understand how he bought this and why he bought it, it's important because he wanted to have a place. It wasn't just that he wanted them to do him a favor. He wanted to actually like own the land. And he's a resident alien. He has some water rights at a well, and now he wants to own some real estate of the land in God's in Canaan, which is the land that God had promised to him and to his descendants. And so as he is doing this, he's the leader of the Hittites, Ephron, is saying like, look, 400 shekels. You're a rich man. I'm a rich man. I don't care about money. You don't care about money. Let me just let me do this for you. Bury your wife. But Abraham is insistent to buy it in the presence of witnesses because he wants to have this land to be a place for him and his family. And so, as we saw earlier, he was given 1,000 shekels, and now he's using 400 shekels to buy some land. So it's just an interesting little piece of information. Like, this is how this was purchased, and the tying again here to the I've lost my train of thought. Tying again to the reference to trees, all throughout the story so far, Abraham has camped near the trees. The trees are places and signs of fertility and fruitfulness, and so he's bought not just the cave to bury, but the land. One of the interesting things about burial in the ancient world too is like they would often just bring the deceased's body and lay it in a cave, like they did with Jesus. They laid Jesus in a cave, and after a period of time where the body would have decomposed, they would gather up the bones and put them in what's called an ossuary, and then they would put those ossuaries in a part of the cave. And so when you read the Bible and it says, and he was gathered to his fathers, talking about the kings as they died, what that is believed to mean in some with some scholars is that the bones were gathered together and they put his bones next to his dad's bones, gathered with his fathers. And so this is part of what Abraham is doing. Like, he's building this cave, and he's going to eventually, when Sarah, her body has decomposed, like gather her bones together and put them in an ossuary. Jacob and his descendants, they go to Egypt, and Joseph asks, or he asks Joseph, like, hey, when you leave here, take my bones out of Egypt and bring them to the land. And Joseph asks that request as well, that they would take his bones and put them in the tomb here in Mamre. And so, so that is the section that we were going to go through today, through chapter 23. So, are there any questions on what we covered today? There was a lot, and so I was trying to not fire hose, but there was a lot of information that might have felt like a fire hose. So, any questions?
I guess it's not a question, but it's more of a statement. This is Carrie.
Yeah.
It seems like Abraham voluntarily gives up, Ishmael, basically to make peace. But then when I read the passage where it says, now that I know you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. I was taken aback by that at first. I was like, that's not his only son. He had two. He has Ishmael and Isaac. So it's kind of a weird concept. He voluntarily gives up that one, but then he also almost voluntarily gives up Isaac also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, God
So
didn't ask him to give up Ishmael, basically. He said it, he did it to placate the whole family.
yeah, well, part of the Ishmael piece is Ishmael was not God's plan to fulfill the promise. He was Abraham's plan to make God's plan happen.
Right.
And so part of why God is saying like send him away is because he wants Abraham to trust him that he will fulfill the promise through Isaac. Isaac is the son of the promise and not Ishmael. And so Abraham is a really messy character in the story of the Bible. Like he is not perfect. And sometimes people put him like way up on this pedestal of like, man, this guy just does everything right all the time. But that's a very selective reading of the story of Abraham. It's ignoring the times that he told people that his wife was his sister. It's ignoring the time that he and Sarah came up with a plan to make God's plans happen. It's ignoring the times that he like just did not act in faith, but he acted in fear. And so here with Ishmael is he's starting to act in faith. Like what he's doing, like it would be hard and probably impossible for us to even like put ourselves there. But he's acting in faith that God will make a way. And God does. And then when he's asked to like offers Isaac, this is an even bigger test of faith. Will God make a way? Will God provide? And Abraham, I would imagine that Abraham, as he was going up the mountain, and every time Isaac asked him about it, he's like, God will provide. God will provide. I don't know if he was saying that for Isaac as much as he was saying it for himself. And there are times where I know this, like I have to tell people what I believe God is going to do. And I'm telling people that because I need to remind myself.
Yeah.
You know, like this is not forever. This is a thing that God is doing. We can get through this together. I'm saying those things out loud, knowing that like, I don't know how that's going to happen, but I trust that God will provide. And so, yeah, so these two stories, Isaac and Ishmael contrast in their relationship with Abraham, both are offered to the Lord. And yeah, it's increasingly intense as they're offered to the Lord for Abraham. So, because he was distressed with the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac and Hagar and Sarah, like that was distressing him. But it was also, it probably built a little bit more peace in their home as well to not have Hagar and Ishmael. And they ended up being okay. They ended up doing their thing. God said he would take care of them. So yeah, very bizarre stories. Like these two, like it's like, oh, I really pray that the Lord never asks any of us to have to do any of those kinds of things. So
Yeah. Well, the other thing you had was that, Abraham lies about his wife being his sister. And yes, it's that quote white lie. It's kind of half truths. Um, it just seems like God still blesses him, even though he blatantly lied out of fear.
yeah,
It's just hard to follow that.
yeah, Abraham is not a perfect person. And so what the writer is like, when you think about like the inspiration of scripture, like the fact that these stories are included in the Bible is one of the reasons why I trust scripture, is because like, why would they leave this in here if they didn't want us to know?
Yeah.
And all the way back in the first week, one of the things I said about the Bible is we have to remember that God is the hero of the Bible.
Right.
Abraham is not the hero. He is a character. He's a major character throughout the story. What Abraham does will shape the nation of Israel, will shape the faith for thousands and thousands of years. And Abraham was the one that God chose. But in God choosing Abraham, God is the hero, not Abraham. And we're going to continue to see the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They and their children are not like all great all the time. They are very fallen people. But through it all, God is still saying, like, I'm going to keep using fallen people, not to say, wow, aren't fallen people great? But to say, I'm going to keep using fallen people because they're not great, but I want you to see my greatness through them.
Right.
And that is one of the comforts of scripture for me, even like, for us, we're all imperfect people, but God is still choosing to use imperfect people for his work. And it's that when you recognize like how imperfect you are and how desperately you need the Lord, that's when you start to see his work in your life in a more humbling way. You just start recognizing this is not me. This is not me doing this. This is God at work. So I think after Abraham's lie to Abimelech, and he prays for them and he heals them, and God heals the people. And then we see that's when God makes it possible for Sarah to conceive. Like, I don't think that is on accident, that the timing here is like, pray for somebody else, bless somebody else, and you're going to see God's blessing in your life in some way, somehow. And
Do you think it's because the lie had been rectified?
I don't think I don't think it is about the rectification, if that's a word, rectifying the lie. I don't think, I think it is more about like God showing up to say, like, I am choosing Abraham. He's my guy that I'm choosing, even though he is messed up. It's not even about it. The truth would have been found out eventually, and it is not it is like, it's not the whole truth, but it's also not a total lie. Like, it's a messy story. It's just messy. But it is that whole interaction between Abimelech and between Pharaoh, like, those are there to show you that God is watching out for Abraham and Sarah, because God is the hero. And so, yeah. So, I mean, thank God for that. That we can look back and say, God is watching out for me because he's the hero, not me. And so, yeah. All right. Any other thoughts or questions? These are some weird passages. So,
Yeah. How many children did Isaiah have?
Isaac?
Isaac.
Isaac had Jacob and Esau. I can't remember if he had any daughters.
I was just curious if did he have a lot of them, or did he just have one or two?
He had at least two.
Well, the good, or the part of it that I realize is that it seems like there's two on the God side, and then there's 100 maybe on the other side.
What do you mean, two?
Well, not Abimelech. Well, take Abimelech and the son, the other son. I'm tired tonight.
Yeah.
It lists all the children in there with his brother.
Abraham's brother.
Yeah.
So that is Abraham's brother.
There was a long list of them, but I
Yeah.
didn't see any of Abraham or Isaac's.
Yeah. So
I wondered, is it coming later?
Are you talking about Isaac's siblings or
Yeah.
Isaac's children?
Children.
Yeah. So we have I'm just looking for an actual genealogy here.
Yeah, Isaac wouldn't have had any because Sarah only had the one.
Right.
I was just curious. I didn't know if I've noticed that a lot of times there's like two children in a family, and you'd think with them living 100 and some years that there would be a bazillion kids.
Yeah.
But and then listening to like Abimelech keeping the women from getting pregnant, and Sarah too, for that matter. And then God in his time opens the doors.
Yeah.
It would apply in our own lives for that matter.
That is true. Yeah, I do think it is about trusting the Lord and his timing and not our own timing.
Yeah, I was just curious if it all came down to just a little small group on the good side and everything multiplied on the bad side. Not
Oh,
necessarily bad, but
yeah.
and that's how the world populated, maybe.
Oh,
For
maybe.
the bad people.
Yeah, I don't the writer of Genesis is not asking those same questions that you're asking, Sandy.
And I couldn't find the family tree on it. I looked for it a little bit, but
Yeah, so Isaac just has the 2.
I was just kind of curious.
And
I had another question too.
yeah.
Chapter 22:6, I think it is. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Did he place it on him like a backpack?
Yeah, that's probably what it is. Or like
I
he's
wondered, and I
holding
thought, did he have them all prepared? And the kid just went along.
Yeah, I don't know. I do think it is more like Isaac is becoming like the beast of burden to carry the wood up the mountain. So like
That's what I wondered,
same
but
way you would put
the
it
way
on
it's
like a
written, I
GoPro.
kind of went, oh.
So he's putting it on him because Isaac's going to carry it. Because Abraham's an old man. Like, I can't carry all this stuff.
Yeah.
And so like, here, you get the heavy stuff, son. You're young. Yeah. But that is a weird phrasing there. Like,
Yeah, that's why I was just kind of curious out of just funness of finding out.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I read it today, I thought he made his kid carry all that wood. Whoa.
Yeah. Well, someone had to do it.
Yeah.
Well, he had slaves that could have done it.
Well, part of the interesting thing there is there were the 2 guys who came along and he said, you stay here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, God didn't tell Abraham to not bring those 2 guys up.
Yeah.
But you start to ask, like, why would Abraham not want their help even further? And it's probably because
it was like it was a secret.
Well, it's hard enough.
Yeah.
And like he's wanting to obey God. And if these 2 servants saw Abraham try to kill Isaac, would they have tried to stop him?
Yeah.
Like those kinds of things where it's like, I don't want to bring anybody else in on this, then I have to. Because I really want God to, like, I'm going to trust that God will provide a way, but I don't want to make it harder than it needs to be. So, because this would have been hard. So,
is this also foreshadowing? Because Jesus is of Isaac's bloodline, correct?
yeah.
Future forward.
They're all descendants of Abraham. So the Jews are all descendants of Abraham through Isaac.
And was Isaac, I mean, Jesus is of Jesse bloodline, correct?
Yeah.
Jesse's
So the
bloodline.
line
And
of
that
David,
came from Isaac also?
Yep, because they're all Jews. So all the Jews, the people of Israel, they're all from Isaac, from Abraham.
So is this maybe a minute foreshadowing to Jesus? Because Isaac, who was going to be the offering, had to carry his own wood, kind of like maybe Jesus, the wood of the cross, but he didn't have to follow through with it.
Isaac did not have to.
Right.
Yeah. So the writer of Genesis would not have known that they were foreshadowing the life of Jesus.
Yeah, but it's weird. But when you're reading
when we read the life of Jesus, we are reminded, the sacrifice of Isaac that Abraham was going to do, God did fully. God went all the way through.
Yeah, Jesus did it fully.
Did it for us. So yeah. So there is some, when we read the life and ministry of Jesus, we are seeing echoes often in events in the Old Testament. And, those are intentional because the life of Jesus is a recreation of the people of Israel. In Jesus's faithfulness, he is making a new nation where the nation of Israel was unfaithful time and time again. Jesus is reconstituting the nation based on his faithfulness and his complete fulfillment of God's covenant for us. And so, so that's a really big thing. And and so understanding the Bible and the story of Scripture, and then getting to the life and ministry of Jesus is one of the things where like, oh, I see. This is all like God is orchestrating this on purpose when we read about Jesus to help us see how he is the fulfillment of the hopes of the people of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So when you make those connections, Carrie, like, yes, those are good and important connections for us. I don't want to put those thoughts in the narrator of Genesis. I don't want to put those thoughts in their mind because they would not have known.
No, they would have never
Yeah.
known.
You know, so we just have to like walk that road carefully. So even when we read the prophets, the Gospels will quote the prophets. The prophets might not have really pictured what Jesus ultimately fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but there are things that we see like, oh, the prophets were talking about this, and here Jesus is doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. So we have to just kind of be careful not to put too much in the prophet's mind that,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
It's wild. It's just weird reading it, the backwards to the beginning.
Right. Yeah.
And how it all correlates. You wish you could do that in time. Okay, here it is here. Now look backwards. This is how it all fulfilled. See it?
Yeah, that would be helpful. So that's part of what I want to do with this whole journey, book by book, is help us see how it all fits together. Because that's when it becomes really exciting. When you start reading, you're like, oh, wow, this is a whole thing. So you'll read through Ezekiel and you're like, why would I do that? Because there's so much about Jesus and his ministry that echoes the ministry of Ezekiel. It's beautiful. And so, yeah. All right. Good connections, Carrie. Any other questions? If not, then we should go to celebrate our wonderful Thanksgivings and all that stuff. So, all right. Okay. Well, y'all have a wonderful night, and we'll be back next week.
Okay.
And it'll be a super fun time.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good
All
night.
right, happy
Tony, I'm
Thanksgiving.
glad you could make it.
Good night. Yep.
Bye, man.
All right. Bye-bye.